For over a century, it was London, the global colonial power, who ruled over the Southeast Asian nation of Burma. After a hard-fought struggle for independence from the British Empire, the country today called Myanmar went from the oppression of colonization to decades under isolated military rule. A 2015 election would bring a taste of democracy under the leadership of State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, until another military coup in 2021 would see her arrested and imprisoned again. Today, little if nothing is known about her whereabouts, while the country descends into civil war. I'm Andrea Sankey, and on this special edition of the Newsmakers, I'm in London to speak to the son of Aung San Suu Kyi, Kim Aris, about his mother's condition and Myanmar's forgotten fight for democracy. It wasn't long ago when Myanmar's democratic transition inspired the world. Its figurehead Aung San Suu Kyi would win the Nobel Peace Prize for her decades-long fight to dismantle a military dictatorship. She mostly won that battle, but went on to lose in the International Court of Public Opinion a few years later. For many in Myanmar, she is still a beacon of democracy and human rights. But for critics, she's a woman who stood by while a genocide unfolded. Aung San Suu Kyi is the daughter of the independence hero Aung San. In 1947, when Suu Kyi was just 2 years old, her father Aung San was assassinated by his political rivals. He was considered the father of modern Myanmar, but never lived to see its independence from the UK a few months later. But its democracy lasted only until 1962, when General Ne Win took power in a military coup. In 1964, Suu Kyi went to the UK to study philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University. There, she met her future husband, academic Michael Aris. The two had married in 1972 and had 2 sons, Alexander and Kim. In 1988, Suu Kyi returned home to take care of her ill mother, and she found a country in the midst of political upheaval. People fed up with decades-long socialist military rule and economic struggles had risen up. On August 8, 1988, hundreds of thousands marched across the country and were met with the military's brute force. An estimated 3,000 people were killed. Ne Win resigned, but the military held on to power. The uprising gave birth to the National League for Democracy, or NLD, whose members propelled Suu Kyi to lead them. In late August of '88, she addressed 500,000 people at Yangon's iconic Shwedagon Pagoda.
I believe that all the people who have assembled here have without exception come with the unshakable desire to strive for and win a multi-party democratic system. In order to arrive at this objective, all the people should march unitedly in a disciplined manner towards the goal of democracy.
The following year, Suu Kyi was put under house arrest for endangering the state. When the junta called elections in 1990, the NLD won 82% of the seats. But the military refused to hand over power. Suu Kyi was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 for her nonviolent struggle for democracy and human rights. And finally, in 1995, she walked free.
We still need support. We're nowhere near the goal yet. We're just starting out. We're at 0, and we want to go on, and we need help.
But she remained in and out of house arrest in the following years. Facing increasing international pressure, the army drafted a new constitution in 2008, claiming it would start a multi-party democracy. But the first elections in 2010 were boycotted by the NLD, and the military-backed party retained power. 5 years later, though, the almost unthinkable happened. The NLD won a landslide victory to end total military rule, although the constitution still gave enormous power to the military. Suu Kyi was now Myanmar's state councillor, but her leadership was marred by the brutal crackdown on the Rohingyas. In 2017, the Myanmar military burned down villages, killed thousands of Rohingya Muslims, raped and sexually abused women. The UN described the violence as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. More than 770,000 Rohingya, fleeing the genocide, took shelter in Bangladesh. Suu Kyi was accused of doing little to stop the atrocities, and she stood before the International Court of Justice in defense of Myanmar.
Please bear in mind this complex situation and the challenge to sovereignty and security in our country when you are assessing the intent of those who attempted to deal with the rebellion. Surely, under the circumstances, genocidal intent cannot be the only hypothesis.
At the next election in 2020, her party won an even bigger majority. But the military-backed opposition refused to recognize the results and accused the NLD of fraud. Using that justification, the military overthrew Suu Kyi, ending the fragile democratic transition. The 79-year-old leader was sentenced to 27 years in prison in more than a dozen cases. The military authorities also violently cracked down on pro-democracy protests. But the return to military rule only served to galvanize pro-democracy supporters and led various ethnic rebel groups to unite against the junta. And as they slowly take more and more territory, the military faces its biggest challenge yet to its rule. So with so much changing on the ground in Myanmar, but very little truly reliable information getting out of the country, I'm joined now by Aris, the son of Aung San Suu Kyi, to talk first about his mother, her journey, his experience as her son, and what's known about her condition now. Aris, thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Hi, Andrea.
Great to have you. I first need to ask what you've actually heard from your mother. The media knows that in January you received one letter. In how many years? And is that all you know of her condition?
Yes, since before the coup, that letter is the only communication I've had from my mother. And that came as a reply from a letter I sent last year when we heard that she was very unwell in prison in Naypyidaw. And I was finally allowed to send a care package to her, along with the letter. So.
And what did it say?
The letter that I received from her, she can't say too much. We know that our correspondence will be read, so it's only really personal things. She said that the conditions that she was being kept under, not the best, let's put it that way. She mentioned the extreme heat. And from what I've gathered from reading Sean Turnell's account of his time in prison in Naypyidaw, the conditions are pretty horrendous.
But you're certain that letter was from her?
Absolutely, it was in her handwriting, and I can tell from the style it was written in as well.
Okay, how worried are you about her health? I mean, we have to remember she's almost 80 years old.
Yeah, and the conditions, like I said, that she's been kept under, going to be pretty diabolical. So at her age, I do really worry about her health.
Now, they had told you, or at least you'd heard, that she was moved to house arrest. But you know that's not true.
Well, there's been rumours of her being moved to house arrest on and off over the last 3 years, and none of them have been independently verified. So there's no way of ascertaining where she is exactly, but our best guess is she is still in prison in Naypyidaw.
She's been in prison or under house arrest for so much of your life, but you've always had some kind of contact, some kind of knowledge. This is different this time. This silence for now years on end. Why? Why do you think the military is treating her this way this time?
Well, it's hard to say what their agenda is in that respect, but I think keeping her separate from everybody else in Burma is to their advantage, even though the Burmese people know that she's still there and with them in their fight for freedom in Burma. Not being able to communicate with her people is going to be to the military's advantage, and also just stopping her from having any communication with the outside world.
You know, you feel now almost in a position that you're the only person left to speak for your mother. Who else? She used to be a figure of international renown, and now, as I said earlier on, she became somewhat of a liability because of what happened. I want to speak a little bit further about that in a minute. But first of all, do you feel you're kind of alone now to speak for her cause?
I know that there's a lot of other people who still support my mother, despite what the story in the international media has been over the years. There's a lot of support. Well, in Burma especially, everybody still supports my mother, and a lot of people around the world still support her, despite what has been said. But I am one of the few people who has a voice.
Yeah. And you know, it is so interesting that you're using your voice now, because for so many years you actually avoided any kind of media attention, even though you were the son of such a prominent figure. So really, at what moment did you decide this has to change? I need to speak to people like me right now to defend my mother?
Well, it was after the coup and the fact that I had no communication with my mother and the situation in Burma was deteriorating so rapidly. I felt I simply had to say something.
Yeah. I want to go back to when, well, twofold actually. Let's start with the best parts. Kind of the pivotal moment, if there was one, when you realized exactly who your mother was and exactly what she meant to so many millions of people in Myanmar. Was it perhaps in 1988 when you saw her speaking at the pagoda for the first time? Or was there another moment, maybe more personal, when you saw, oh my gosh, my mom is just...
Well, the crowds at that gathering at the pagoda were amazing, and that was a pivotal moment. But also, I suppose, when she was granted the Nobel Peace Prize and other humanitarian awards around that time. And of course, I was with her when she was first put under house arrest. So that would have made an impression.
Right. And that turned, as we said earlier, that things turned from her being celebrated so much so that she won the Nobel Peace Prize to suddenly becoming, someone even described her as the somehow pariah because of her position, they would describe it as, on what was happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar. Many criticized her for not defending a persecuted minority and instead defending the military over accusations of what the international community was calling a genocide. What do you think was misunderstood? Because I know you've said before it was unfair how she was viewed in the international media and in the general public, outside of Myanmar especially.
I think the whole situation was misunderstood. The fact that she was actually trying to do everything she could within her power to rectify the situation without it turning into the bloodbath that it has since, without using language which would have been inflammatory rather than anything constructive. People around the world expected her to speak out against the military and speak out against what was being done to the Muslims in Rakhine State, but that wouldn't have helped the situation at all.
And the people that came to her defense would say she wasn't in a position to defend anybody because she was only in a power-sharing agreement with the military that was technically much more powerful than she was. Was that indeed the case?
Absolutely. This was a transitional government and democracy was not fully fledged.
Yeah.
People think that when the NLD came into power that they could have changed everything straight away. That just wasn't the case. The situation was far more complex and delicate than anybody seems to have realised, not just in Rakhine State, but in Burma as a whole.
So people did turn their back on your mother, and by default on the NLD. And what is the price that Burma, Myanmar, and the world is paying now for this, what people are describing as a forgotten conflict?
Well, that is the price, that people are able to ignore it now. And for some reason, without my mother being the icon that she was, people seem to have abandoned Burma as a whole.
I'll tell you what, I want to ask a little bit before we go about your personal experience growing up with a mother who spent so many years under arrest, threatened by the most powerful people in her country, mostly away from her children. Did you understand what she was really doing? Did you have an appreciation for it, or did that have to grow later when you became an adult?
I think I had an appreciation of it from the beginning, but it's certainly grown on me since, exactly what position she was in and how difficult it was. And I think now that I'm starting to take a bit more of an active role in things, I can see just how hard it was for her.
And even if you didn't understand then, I think you had said one time that your mother had raised you to feel that for as difficult as your life might be, and as much as your mother may be struggling and even suffering, that the life of the ordinary Burmese people was that much more difficult, and they were suffering that much more?
Of course. I think I've been extremely privileged, being brought up over here in England and away from all the conflict and drama of what's happening in Burma.
Yeah.
And compared to what's happened to a lot of people in Burma, my mother's situation is not half as bad.
So when you watched Myanmar finally transition to something resembling the democracy that it claimed under this power-sharing agreement with the military, your mother serving as state counselor, did you finally say that all that struggle, you know, that your family had been through, that Myanmar had been through, was finally worth it? Or did you know that they still weren't there, that this was...
I knew that it was only, well, really the first step on the road to bringing democracy to Burma. But I did think that things were moving forwards, and it was a time to celebrate what had been achieved. Whereas now it seems like all those sacrifices have been for nothing.
Yeah. So I want to look more at those sacrifices and the fighting that's now underway in Myanmar. Because since the coup, various citizen militia and rebel movements throughout the country have joined forces, fought back, and are taking more land. And it's said the military is now closer than ever to losing power. But what that means for the country isn't yet fully understood. Here's a look.
Myanmar's ruling military is under threat from all sides. Latest estimates put the amount of territory under the various rebel groups' control at over 80%. This map shows how Myanmar's military has lost almost its entire border area, and that greatly restricts the junta's ability to raise funds for its war effort. The areas in red are all that's left of the junta's control. They are, though, the most heavily populated regions of Myanmar, home to the biggest ethnic group, the Bamars. Since October last year, when 3 disparate ethnic rebel groups entered an alliance, the rebels have made major gains, especially along the Chinese border and in the far western Rakhine state near Bangladesh.
We need unity, and then we make it step by step with the other nations, and then we work together with other groups by coordinated attack to the military. Then we put on the political common ground, and then we will make our position, our cause with the people, and then we defeat the coups.
The Chinese have possibly more influence over the military than any other country, with large amounts of investment and a reliance on Myanmar's gas exports. But they've tired of cyber scam centres which are based all along their border, generating billions of dollars of revenue for Chinese gangs working alongside military cronies. The centres not only kidnap Chinese nationals to work inside Myanmar, but also then scam citizens inside China. The rebels' promise to help rid the area of the centres has worked against the military. They now only control a single Chinese border region in northern Shan state, and that looks set to fall soon. In a sign of the military's increasing desperation, they imposed enforced conscription 3 months ago. But it's not clear whether that has boosted their ranks, albeit with inexperienced fighters, or led to a further exodus of young men into the areas controlled by the rebel armies or to neighbouring countries.
The conscription law means we have to kill each other. We are not fighting a war against foreign enemies, we're fighting each other in a civil war. I don't want it to be this way, and the situation in my village is not good, so I fled to Thailand.
There are consistent reports from rebel groups that Myanmar's troops are demoralised and surrendering without much of a fight when confronted on the battlefield. The generals have pledged to hold an election in 2025, but in March they backtracked, saying it could only be held in secure areas which they control. On the diplomatic front, the ASEAN grouping, of which Myanmar is a member, is actively pushing for the generals to begin talks with its enemies. But their dedication to non-interference in members' internal affairs restricts the amount of sway they hold. They came up with a 5-point consensus plan in 2021, which encouraged a ceasefire and dialogue. That's gone nowhere. The United States and Europe have reimposed sanctions on the country and individual generals, which has hindered the military's access to the global banking system. But the junta is no stranger to sanctions, having been under them for decades before they restored partial democracy. And as for Aung San Suu Kyi's formerly ruling National League for Democracy party, its members have largely gone into exile and formed the National Unity Government of Myanmar, which the European Parliament has recognised as the legitimate government. And despite her current arrest, Suu Kyi remains at the top. But the worry for the NUG is that as ethnic rebel groups become increasingly emboldened and potentially win the civil war, their long-standing claims for independence will be hard to counter. The country could easily split into multiple states, much like Yugoslavia did after the Balkan Wars, and Suu Kyi's dream of again leading a unified Burma may be left in tatters.
So as the country descends further into civil war, Kim Aris is with me again to talk about the state of fighting now in Myanmar and whether it gives you a sense of hope or a sense of despair. Where do you think Myanmar is going with this new round of fighting?
I think that the fact that the country is in the state that it is in is extremely sad. I think my mother will be extremely sad to see the fighting that's happening now. After years of trying to bring about a peaceful reconciliation to the situation there. And after all the fighting is done, there will still have to be negotiations and talking, and that will take even more time now that the country has had to have gone through what it has over the past few years.
Right. And the greatest fear I can imagine for, even your mother now, and even for the military, because one thing the military always promised was to keep Myanmar united. But because of their own intransigence, the country is now splintering, and there are a lot of fears that it will splinter into various independence movements and fracture so badly that it will no longer be a country.
That is a possibility, but at the same time, the one thing that has come out of this military coup is everybody else has started working together far better than they ever did before. So we can hope that perhaps moving forwards, that sense of unity will go forwards with it.
You want someone to be taking action. Who could help?
The entire international community could be doing a great deal more to help the situation there, not just in terms of providing humanitarian aid to all of those affected by the ongoing conflict, but also in increasing their sanctions on aviation fuel and that kind of thing. The military have increased their use of fighter jets against their own people exponentially in the last couple of years, and it's at a height right now.
I mean, there's ASEAN, there's China, there's Western sanctions you're talking about that could put significant pressure on the junta. Where are you seeing maybe the best effort made and the worst efforts made? Who's failing?
I'd have to say everybody's failing at the moment, I'm afraid.
But who would you want? Who really does have?
China, being one of the most powerful neighbours, if not the most powerful neighbour, could do a lot more. And the fact that the instability in Burma is having an effect on what's happening in China should rouse them to do more.
Yeah, scam centers, for one thing.
Yeah.
Do you ever think, though, that your mother could lead again the same movement under a democratic regime in Myanmar after all that's happened? Or has that been destroyed?
I don't know what will come about if my mother is freed again and democracy restored to Burma, but I think that she will always be trying to do everything she can to help her country. Again, she's almost 80 now, and she's spent almost a quarter of her life incarcerated for trying to bring democracy to Burma. I don't think she's going to give that up anytime soon.
But at this point, it doesn't seem like any power-sharing agreement with the military would work.
No, I don't think that would work. I think the military have burnt their bridges there.
Still, they're saying they're going to hold elections in 2025. Do you believe that?
We shall see. They've held elections before and not honoured the results, so even if they do hold elections, I wouldn't hold anything.
And like you said, she is 80 years old. It might not make sense for her to re-enter the political leadership. So does she have someone, is there, a protege of hers that you feel could match what she's done?
Unfortunately, not as far as I'm aware. I think that there are many new, younger leaders coming up in the ranks, as it were, but none of them have quite got the support that my mother's had in the past, and I don't know if they ever will.
Just to finish, you were saying you felt you needed to step up to defend your mom, to speak on behalf of Myanmar. If by chance she gets to see this program now, what do you want to say to her?
Well, I would just like to send her my love as always and say that I hope to see her before too long and that Burma can once again return on its path towards democracy. It was the world's youngest democracy and now it's gone back decades.
And it was her life's mission to bring it forward.
Yeah, and so many other people have sacrificed so much to get this far.
Okay.
And now it seems like at least the youth of Burma have tasted democracy and they aren't going to give it up.
Okay. Kim Aris, I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. And I'd like to thank our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.